the school and the church and your family will celebrate an important birthday. Tell me, when and where were you born?
I was born November 24th, 1909, English, Indiana. That's a small town about 50 miles from Louisville, Kentucky, on the Indiana side, of course. And we lived on a little farm, about 50 acres of land, and one little two-room house. And back in that days, living rather primitive, you know, no electric lights, no water system, just way out in the country.
What did your father do?
He was a farmer. He farmed the land, did some of it, and then he began being a carpenter. He had never done that before, but when he got a little hard-pressed for money, he began to take jobs building houses, and did that for most of his life until he passed away.
Tell me about how old you were, and tell me about the experience when you became a Christian, when you accepted Christ.
Well, I was 14 years of age in Louisville, Kentucky, and had been going to the high school, first to Louisville Male High School, then to Fern Creek High School out of Louisville. And a young friend of mine named Claude Martin took me to Sunday school for the first time in my life. I went to the Cedar Creek Baptist Church about 14 miles from Louisville, Kentucky. And back in the Sunday school classroom, the teacher's name was Mrs. Daisy Halls, very interesting lady. And she taught boys, which is unusual. About 15 or 20 of them came into the room every Sunday morning, and she taught them. But she began every Sunday by giving the way of salvation. Didn't vary one particle. She'd tell how to be saved. And I heard it for the first time from that lady when I was 14 years of age. Never heard it before. And after listening to her for a few Sundays, I knew I was lost and needed Christ, and I received him as my Savior very definitely. And I let it be known that I would. And I told my family that I'd accepted Christ, and I planned to go forward in church, and I did. And on that Sunday morning when I came to the front, the pastor's name was J.N. Benford, a very interesting, wonderful man with the Lord now. But he gave a name, and as he was talking to me, my mother and father came down the aisle. They were there. I didn't know they were there. They came in and sat in the back of the building. They came forward and said, we'd like to be Christians too. And they accepted Christ at that time. We were baptized at the same time. An old church in Louisville, Kentucky, a Deer Park Baptist, I'll never forget that. Went into the city. We had no baptistry in our church, so went into the city and we were baptized in the Deer Park Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky.
Did you feel like when you became a Christian, did you almost know instantly that God was going to call you, or did that to preach, or did that come later?
No, Mike, I didn't come to that. I didn't think of that really. At that time, I was interested in music, and I'd been doing a little bit of singing as a boy, and I liked that very much. But I never thought of being a minister. That hadn't occurred to me until one Sunday morning when I was 18 years of age in the church. I heard a man speak, and God spoke to my heart about the ministry. And I felt then very definite that he was calling me. So I left my place in the back and came to the front. And I stood there, and they gave my name to the audience and said, now this young man feels called to preach. We'll sing another verse of the song, maybe others feel called. So when they stood there, 8 more joined with me. There were 9 of us in all. I remember that quite well. And one young man stood by my side, I can't forget him, Claude Martin, a very prominent farmer out of Louisville. And he came forward. But out of the 9 who came with me, I'm the only one that went on in the ministry. The others started, and then most of them stopped after a while and turned to something else.
Those of us who are called to Christian service sometimes don't completely understand the call to the mission field or the call to preach. Was there no doubt in your mind you knew what God wanted you to do, or was it an exploration?
No, I felt that He wanted me to preach. And that, of course, is something far from my line. I was timid as a boy, and I wasn't sure what I could do in a crowd before a crowd, but I felt that was it. And I did feel that call. And after my answering the call at 18, I wanted to preach, and so I decided I better preach my first sermon somewhere, even best I could do. So I found a man in Jeffersontown, Kentucky, that's out of Louisville, had a little chapel out in the country. That's an interesting word, that word chapel, and a little one-room building. And I asked him if I could preach there on a Sunday afternoon, my first sermon. And I worked hard on that a long time. I had it written on big sheets of typing paper. And I got there to the church. I thought there'd be 4 or 5 people there. I'd be happy. And I could give my first sermon. But instead of that, the place, the little church was full. People had announced it, and they were coming out of curiosity, and they were there. I don't tell this often, but my sermon is typed on legal typing paper, and I had it down before me in that little church building, a tiny little place, and I was up there trying to preach the sermon, but all of a sudden there came a strong gust of wind through the building and blew that sermon clean over the floor, and I had to stop. I had nothing I could do, nothing I could say, so I gave it up at once.
Gave the invitation, and that was the end.
That's right. That's the end of it. Yes, sir.
When did you and Mrs. Roberson meet, and where?
We met in Birmingham, Alabama, and I think I'm right in that. I was holding a meeting at Ensley Baptist Church in Birmingham, and in that meeting I met her for the first time.
Pastored there later on at Fairfield.
Right. That's about 4 miles away from there. Mm-hmm.
You lost a daughter named Joy, and I want to ask you about Camp Joy in a little while. I know that's been an important part of your ministry. Tell me about your other children. I went to school with one of your daughters. How many children do you have?
Well, we had Johnny, my son, and Leanne, daughter, and June. And then we adopted a little girl that we had with us for a number of years. And that was the family, our family.
And all of them are very involved in different churches and
very much at the present time, yes, sir, at the present time, all of them.
Your first pastorate was where? Was that Fairfield, Alabama? That was the last one before you went to Highland Park. Where did you first pastor at church?
I pastored first in Germantown, Tennessee. That's on the edge of Memphis. An old church, more than 125 years old when I was there. And I stayed there 1 year. Then I resigned and did some singing work in churches for a while. And I was called to Greenbrier, Tennessee. That's out of Nashville, where I went and spent 3 years in that church.
Tell me about going to Chattanooga, to Highland Park Baptist Church. You did come from Fairfield, Alabama.
Yes, I was in Fairfield, Alabama for 5 years. I've been the evangelist for the Birmingham Baptist Association for 3 years, and then I took the church, stayed there 5 years in that church, and we had a good ministry. Then I was called to the Highland Park Baptist Church in Chattanooga, and went there and spent 40 years and 6 months in one place.
You had a lot of great joys, seeing that church grow.
Wonderful, wonderful.
People.
From one single building on the corner, and the Sunday school at first about 100, 125, and we grew to thousands and bigger buildings.
When did you first feel that you ought to start a school, a Bible school, finally a college, then a seminary?
Yes, that's interesting. When I got into Highland Park, I saw so many areas of the city that were untouched by fundamental churches. And I began starting chapels, little mission points around the city and out of the city. And from those mission points, I had to have men to preach. At first, I used deacons or any young man that could get to go out, but I knew I needed someone to be in there steady and to preach and build churches. So I felt led of God in 1946 to be in Tennessee Temple Schools and offer 2 years of college at first and 3-year Bible school when it first began. And we announced that we were doing it, and I think the first year I had about 125 coming in for that school. That was the beginning. But it all came out of the matter of having pastors for little chapels that I'd organized around the city in areas that were untouched, and I needed men to fill those places.
Some who may not know may think, oh, he started a few chapels. That grew to many, many chapels until how many were there?
Oh, at one time, I think at one time we had 95. Right. And they were all the way from the Chattanooga, about 15 to 75 miles away. We had them in Daisy, Tennessee, and down toward Atlanta, Georgia, and northern Knoxville, Tennessee, quite a few. We tried to find areas that were untouched by any church. We'd use schoolhouses or homes, or we'd even put them in a barn. Sometimes we've had to serve in a barn or in a garage, put chairs in, go ahead. But they were built because we saw the need. And then when the school came along, when I put the school in, we had plenty of men then to go out and preach them during the week.
You were meeting a need, you were starting chapels, reaching the lost through that. As you started Tennessee Temple, what were your top priorities? Because it is a unique place, it always has been.
Well, the first thing we had in mind was training young people for Christian service. And that would be for ministry, for the pastorate, for mission work at home and abroad. And that was the first idea we had, was getting young people trained in service. And so we began the school for that purpose, to train young people.
One of the things I appreciated most about my years there, and I hear this from other Temple graduates, are the great men of God that you brought to Tennessee Temple, and made sure they were in chapel and made sure we were in chapel
Mm-hmm.
and heard them. Back in that age, we may not have had enough sense to know we ought to hear these great men, but you knew that. I want to name some of the men that touched our lives and have you comment on them. Dr. Lester Roloff, what he meant to you and to Tennessee Temple.
You've named the most unusual man in the world. Nothing like him. Lester Roloff was made one time. There's no one ever been like him in the world in the history of it. But a unique man, a very, very intelligent man. A graduate of Baylor University, had the seminary work from one of the Southern Baptist seminaries. Then he became an independent Baptist, started independent work for helping men and women. And unique in his preaching. No one could preach like him. And he'd read a text but may not refer to it again for an hour. But could preach and had lots to say. Really a very intelligent man, very intelligent. And was well received by people everywhere. People grew to love him. He was strange, different from anyone, but still a man of character, and that would show in his sermons, revealed all of the time. And he did a mighty work, both in the pulpit and also in private. His private, personal life was beautiful and wonderful.
Another man who didn't have to come very far, just down off of Missionary Ridge, but a favorite of the students was Dr. Fred Brown.
Oh yes, Fred Brown was unique and wonderful. And from the time of my beginning in Chattanooga until his death, we were close. But Fred was a unique preacher. Another man who was quiet in his delivery, but very definite, very positive. And what he said was usually right to the point. And had a sense of humor that the young people loved and did in chapel, as you recall. When he was speaking in chapel, he had them laughing half of the time. But it was a unique way of saying it. With him all the way through the years, I was in Chattanooga and with Brother Fred, and then I stood by his bedside shortly before he passed away. And even in his time of suffering and agony as death was approaching, he still had smile, a little smile on his face that you recall so well. And he looked at you, and with a little smile, it's everything's all right, everything's all right. And yet he was near the time, but it was homegoing.
Before I ever came to Tennessee Temple, my parents took me to hear Dr. John R. Rice.
Oh yes, another unique man. Dr. Rice, different from everyone in the world. He was a great preacher and a great author, wrote many, many wonderful books, and a great organizer, and really in the Sword of the Lord, his paper that he put out, he touched the lives of many thousands. And John R. Rice was a unique man, but a very good man. And what he preached from the pulpit about his living and character was carried out in his life. No one ever found fault with him. And I've been to his business office over and over again, and everything is quietly and beautifully done. But John R. Rice was a unique and wonderful man.
Though younger, I believe he passed away earlier. His brother, Dr. Bill Rice, was popular as a speaker.
Bill Rice was popular, different from John Rice altogether. Yes. But Bill Rice was unique in his down-to-earth approach to young people. They loved him. And he could stand before a crowd of young people, have them laughing and crying within 10 minutes' time. He knew what to say, he knew how to say it. He had a big heart, he loved people, and showed that in his preaching.
Payday Someday, Dr. R.G. Lee, he preached at Highland Park many times,
yes,
but spoke to the chapel service many times. I'm so thankful I was there to hear Dr.
I'm glad you heard him. R.G. Lee was a unique man. A great memory, a memory for books, for papers, for sermons. He could memorize endlessly sermons and poetry, almost anything. His mind was retentive. And I knew him in Memphis the first time he just began at Bellevue. I went to Germantown, about 5 miles away out of Memphis, and he was at Bellevue. So I got to know him. I taught in his Sunday school training classes. He had me to come, a young preacher, and had me to come, and I recall so well. He had a daughter, beautiful young lady, when I was there, about 12 years of age, I suppose, but a troublemaker. People loved her. But I'm up teaching one night, a big class of young people, 75 young people there, and his daughter disappeared. And then the students began to laugh. The young people began to laugh, and I couldn't settle them down. They wouldn't stop. And I said, "There's something wrong now. What's going on? What's going on?" And I noticed they were looking, so I turned around, and Dr. Lee's daughter was back at the piano, and she was standing up every few moments, making a face at the young people, then going back down again. And that went on for quite a while until I got hold of it and pulled her out of there. But that was R.G. Lee's daughter.
I wonder if Dr. Lee got hold of her too.
I expect when he heard about it, something happened. Yes, sir. That's right.
Dr. Jack Hiles used to come to Bible conferences, Chapel 2. Again, someone whose preaching and sense of humor the students liked.
A unique man, very unique. I knew him in Texas when he first began. I knew him in his first church in Texas, and I've followed him and with him, of course, up in Hammond, where he is now. But a unique man. And when you think of what he had, his characteristics, part of it would go to that down-to-earth personality. People loved him. He could talk where they lived, and he could explain things that they could understand. He's doing that now in this big church, thousands coming all of the time.
A neighbor of his, one of the great Bible teachers you ever brought to us to hear, was Dr. Warren Wiersbe. Just a great teacher. Quiet,
even speaker, never raised his voice. When he comes to us now, we've had him recently speaking to a class, and he was just talking to them, but they still remember him. They talk about Warren Wiersbe because of a unique way of just saying things, and he knows the Word of God. That's a big thing.
And finally, tell me about E.J. Daniels. He preached at Fairfield too.
That's right. I was at Fairfield 5 years, and then I resigned, went to Chattanooga. Then they called Dr. Daniels to come in, and he was there for 5 years, did a very wonderful work. But he was largely an evangelist. Daniels always loved to hold big tent meetings, big revival campaigns, and even while he was in Fairfield, he was going out in meetings for quite a bit of the time.
Dr. Roberson, it's impossible to say how many Bibles you've signed or pictures you've signed. You always sign Romans 8:28, your favorite life's verse. When did that become a verse that you took to heart and was your favorite?
That actually became the verse that spoke to our heart most, was in the death of our baby Joy. That little one given to us, we named her Joy, beautiful child, and suddenly after a few weeks of life she died. And at that time I couldn't understand at all why it would happen, nor could my wife. And I chose Romans 8:28 as a verse back in that day as my verse. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God. And I said, this will be my verse for the rest of my life, and my life text. Yes, sir.
And with her name, that little baby's name, you went on to start Camp Joy.
That's right.
There's many ministries you've been involved
I
with.
felt a big burden for young people, for children. And so I looked for the land. I could find nothing at all at first, and then I was advertised by a government agency, some land at Lake Chickamauga, and I went to the sale. They had it in the Patton Hotel. Big crowd of people there. People wanted the land overlooking Lake Chickamauga. And I stood in the back of the crowd and listened to the auctioneer, a professional, and I said, well, that's beyond my reach, I'll never get it. But he kept talking, told how beautiful it would be. He said, this is good for cabins to be placed up on the hillside overlooking Lake Chickamauga. I listened to all of it, and when he got through, he said, what am I bid? I was in the back of the big crowd, and without thinking, I stood up. I said, sir, I bid $3,000. He laughed. He said, sir, that's not near the mark. He said, thank you, be seated. I sat down. I thought that was all of it. But I made the only bid. No one else made a bid. Not a single word spoken by anyone. And so after about 10 or 15 minutes, he stopped. He said, I don't understand this, but the man back there bid $3,000 for land that's worth $150,000 at least. And he said, I don't understand it, but he said, the land is hit. I closed the sale. I finished up, and I bought the land. I walked up to him. I said, sir, I'm the man that bought the property. He said, yes, I am. I don't understand that. I said, I can explain it to you. He said, no, I'm not interested in explanation. I don't understand. I said, pay the money and you got it. I said, that's another sad thing. I don't have the money. And he said, you'll have to pay for it right now. I begged him for 1 day. I said, if you give me 1 day, I'll bring it back to you. So I went out and borrowed the money and paid him off and began Camp Joy for Children in 1946.
But when you don't have it, 3,000 just as well had been 3 million.
No.
You didn't have it, right?
No, that's right.
Would you like a drink of water before I continue?
I think no.
Right, very good. We talked about great men, great preachers, names anyone listening to this will know. There's another name that we'll never forget that may not be at the top of the list of dynamic great speakers, but could a pastor and a leader of a school ever have a more dedicated, valuable person at their side than you had in Dr. J.R. Faulkner?
That's right.
Tell me about your heart feelings about that man.
I called Dr. Faulkner to come and teach in our school. He was a pastor of a little church in Rossville, Georgia, about 5 miles away. And I had a class that I wanted him to teach. I knew he could do it. And he came in and taught that class. And the young people loved him. And after a time, I saw he had something I needed. a very meticulous person, as you know, for details. Everything has to be right, and a memory for everything that ever happened. And so I invited him to come and be with me, and to be my associate in the church and also to work in the school. And he accepted and came to me. And we were together for many years, and we're still great friends today.
Many of the lessons we learned at Tennessee Temple focused around two things that you always stressed: leadership and consistency. You always provided leadership and consistent leadership. And how important are both of those in your life and in a message that you want us all to know about and remember? And that is that you always said everything rises and falls on leadership. When did you learn that?
I do not know, but I saw that impress on my mind through the years I was there. I would see so many preachers start and go for a while, then quit. I've seen evangelists go into whole revivals for maybe a year, 2 years, and then they give it up. They turn to something else. And I began using the statement for young people, everything rises and falls on leadership. And that, of course, became a part of our thinking. They were training leaders, training pastors, and training missionaries, training song leaders, and music and directors, and so forth. But I don't know where I first got the idea, but it became a part of my ministry in helping young people and helping leadership to be what it ought to be.
You've always been so consistent in your leadership with us. Have you focused on that always? Did it finally become natural for you to be consistent in your Christian life, in your daily life? Just try to, once you set your goals, just stick with it? Has that been your attitude in all things?
I would say generally, after my first year in college at Old Bethel College in Russellville, Kentucky, I began getting a new concept of what I should do. And that's when I began. That's around my 20s, and I've held to that ever since. And I've watched very carefully my life and the life of others around me are in the Lord's service. And I've noticed the weaknesses on the part of some men and the strength of others. And I've found that the Lord blesses those who will stay with the work and keep at it night and day, whether it's good or bad or hot or cold, but continue to serve God in the best way you can.
In your ministry, what would you say has been what has happened in your ministry that you're most satisfied with, pleased with? And I'm not talking about your personal accomplishment, but with God's grace and the people you surround yourself with, what have you been most pleased with?
By far the greatest joy that I have is thinking about the many people I've seen come to the Lord. I've enjoyed putting up buildings. I've built many buildings. I've done many things of that sort, but that all is as nothing compared to the salvation of the soul. And I've seen hundreds and thousands come forward, and I never get tired of that. I love to see them come, whether children or grown people, young or old, to get saved. So I made that the aim of Highland Park for my years there. For 40 years and 6 months, I gave an invitation at the end of every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, every Wednesday night. And in all of that time, we had someone to respond to every invitation, as you know quite well. Maybe 1, 2, maybe a dozen more, but we had people coming. And we made the aim to reach people, to stir hearts, and to get people to respond to the work of God.
You've never preached a sermon without giving an invitation, have you?
Rob,
you've never not given an invitation.
No, I give one. I give one
time.
always, yes, sir. And it may not produce the results I want. I may not see as many come forward, but I feel like I've got to say it to kind of drive home the truth to the people, to make them see they need to make a decision.
Conversely, is there an area that you are disappointed in that didn't quite go the way you hoped it would? Has there been disappointment too?
Sometimes, but nothing serious. I'm thinking of Highland Park now, where I spent 40 years and 6 months. I can't think of any difficulty that would, of any great disappointment. You have disappointment in people who sometimes fail you. They promise to do things and do not do them. But largely, I do not think of any great disappointment that I mentioned.
A few final questions. What advice would you give to young people today? Some of us, as we get older, want to throw up our hands and say, well, the young people today, there's no hope. They're just awful. Things are getting worse all the time, and they may be. But what advice do you give to young people today, teenagers, young adults?
Young people and adults, I would say, first of all, make sure of your salvation. Make sure you know you're born again. And that's so important. This is a sad day. And we hear preachers who invite people to join the church or to live better. That's not the secret. If they're to live better, they've got to know Christ, the Savior, and He must be the example for their lives. And so I press them out of knowing Christ. Then the second thing is to know the will of God. I'm convinced that God has a will for every life. Has a will for your life, a will for my life. I'm to be in His will. Now, I can still live, I can still have partial success out of His will. I'll have the best success and the most peace of heart by knowing I'm doing the thing that God wants me to do.
You still stay very busy doing what you've always done. Have you spent any time, do you think about how folks, years from now, when we're all gone, how folks years from now will remember Dr. Lee Roberson? Do you give that any thought?
I've never given much thought to that. I'm near the time when I'll come to the end of this life. I know that quite well. But I'm not worried about what they say. And I'd like to have some memory in the minds of people of my life. I'd like to, naturally, but I'm not greatly troubled about that part of it.
Have you ever felt let down in any way by the promises of God, by your call to the ministry? Has what you've staked your life on and eternity on, has God ever let you down?
Not at a time, never, not once, not once. I've failed sometime in my way, but His word has never failed. His promises have never failed.
What do you think heaven's going to be like, Dr. Roberson?
Beg your pardon?
What do you think heaven's going to be like?
Oh, my. I'd like to think about it, but I'm not worried about it right now. I'm just taking the word of God for it. It'll be glorious and beautiful. And there's so much that we don't think about. You think about heaven, but you sometimes forget about the reign of Christ upon the earth. He's coming again, and we're going to be with Him, and that's the big part.
You still travel, you still preach like you are here tonight. You want to do that just as long as you
as long as I can, yes, sir.
Can travel and get around.
As long as I can, yes, sir. I'd like to.
I cannot speak for every Tennessee Temple graduate, but I think I can come close by telling you how much we love you.
Thank you.
How much we appreciate the leadership you provided for us while we were at Tennessee Temple, both in the church and in the school as well. You commanded respect from us. We had some fear of you, and I wonder maybe if the beginnings of respect have to do with a little bit of fear of authority. Do you think so?
It might, yes, sir.
But you had stern leadership, but that we never doubted your love for us, and we appreciate that. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, and God bless you.